Welcome everybody. My name's Callum Milne. I'm a level 2 from Nanaimo, and I believe that if you want to truly understand anything that's made by humans, the most important question you can possibly ask is why. Why is this the way it is? Why does it exist? Why was it made? And why is it this way instead of some other way? So this is the way I approach Magic's rules. A lot of the time, when you're learning the rules, they can seem vast and monolithic, something you just have to grind your way through and memorize. But people are really bad at grinding their way through long, boring stuff and memorizing it. By asking why, we can make learning the rules much more interesting, because in reality, the history of Magic's rules is the long history of judges and rules managers trying desperately to claw some coherence out of the stuff that comes out of Wizards' R&D. And not always succeeding. So I'm going to be going, so it becomes a series of stories, and I'm going to be talking about one of those stories today, behind an important part of Magic's rules, the layer system. So the layer system, for those of you who want to recap, is how the rules figure out what any given game object looks like. Who controls it? Is it a creature? What color is it? What's its power and toughness? The layers have you covered. But they didn't always, because the layers didn't always exist. Back in the dim void of prehistory that is 1993, there were no layers. So how did cards interact? Well, it was kind of hard to tell because the rulebook didn't tell you. Instead, all it said was, if you and your opponent can't agree on how cards should work, you can just flip a coin to resolve things. And that was fine, because hey, it's a game, who cares? It's not like it matters. And then the game exploded into popularity. And in 1994, Wizards hosted the Magic World Championships at Gen Con. It went, let's just say, really well. And they wanted to do it again. They started organizing other big tournaments. They had this crazy idea about a pro tour that would award cash prizes. Like that would ever catch on. So, all of a sudden, figuring out how cards work became a much bigger deal. Because when there's a prize on the line, you're not going to be very happy about flipping a coin to see how your cards work. And your opponents are going to be a lot more inclined to argue with you. No. That doesn't work that way. It works the way that makes my deck win. So, in order to support their crazy idea, Wizards had to make rules. And in order for those rules to work, they had to meet some specific criteria. They had to be unambiguous. There couldn't be serious gray areas where people could actually make arguments one way or the other, because that might lead to one tournament having the rules one way, another tournament having the rules the other way, and then players can't expect which way the rules will work at this tournament, and things go all to hell. They had to make sense, because if nothing makes sense, then you're just screwed. And ideally, they should work as much as possible as players would expect them to work already, even without knowing the rules. So they had to work as players would intuitively understand that they should work. Because that way they become a lot easier for everyone to process, and becoming involved in tournaments does not become an arcane process of memorizing, okay, how do all of these rules work so I know what all of my cards do. You can just enter the tournament and all of your cards will work the way you already expect them to work. So, in 1994, 4th edition was released. And this time the rulebook included a section on how those kinds of effects interacted, which was, apply effects in the order they occurred. Yes. And that's it. Which is okay, it's very conceptually simple, it's clear, it feels correct, but can you see the problem with it? How do these two cards interact? I'm taking questions. How do these cards interact? What happens if you have both of these cards on the
Today? Now?
No, at this time.
Oh.
At this time.
Your forests get +0/+2 when they're not attacking and untapped?
It depends which one you play first.
Exactly. Because you apply effects in the order that they were played. So, if you played Living Lands first, all of your forests would be 1/1s, and then you played Castle, they all get +0/+2. But if you play them the other way around, your Castle applies first, all of your creatures get +0/+2, and then Living Lands applies, all of your forests become 1/1s, but Castle has already applied. So they don't get the bonus, which is kind of insane. So this happened all over the place. So when you think about it, there's any number of results like this that players would consider ridiculous, which is why the people who were in charge of the rules at the time immediately started issuing rulings to make things try to make more sense, to take this kind of thing into account. So the first one was, if an effect depends upon checking a characteristic, you must first evaluate anything which changes that characteristic. Unless doing so forms a loop, in which case, apply them in timestamp order, we can't be bothered to deal with loops. So now effects could be dependent on other things. And interestingly, these dependencies applied equally to all effects, no matter where they came from. So if you played Nocturnal Raid, all of your black creatures would get +2/+0. If you played Deathlace after Nocturnal Raid, your creature would become black. And Nocturnal Raid, it looks for black creatures. So it depends on Deathlace. So your newly Deathlace creature now gets +2/+0, where it didn't get it before. Same goes with playing a new creature. If you played a new black creature after Nocturnal Raid came out, it would get +2/+0. So this was okay. It was kind of complicated, but it was okay. It was understandable. There was another exception. If an effect both checks and changes the same characteristic, it doesn't depend on that characteristic. This is because depending on yourself is really a really terrible idea. It basically existed because of this card. So it's kind of confusing, maybe a bit complicated to learn in detail. There's a lot of ugly stuff hidden away in the corners under this system. But that doesn't really matter, because the important part is tournaments aren't affected by this. Because none of those weird corner casey cards from like Alpha or Antiquities would ever be constructed playable. Good job all around, right? We don't care about stuff that happens in casual games because it's not going to matter in tournaments. Well, not so much, because then in 1997, Tempest released. And Wizards released this card. Oh, dear lord. Not just an ability loss card, those had existed before, Titania's Song had existed, but this was a tournament playable ability loss card, which laid bare a fundamental weakness in the existing rulings, because with an ability loss effect around, you don't know for sure which effects exist until you're halfway through determining the order in which you apply effects, which is just insane. And setting the power and toughness of your creatures could cause really strange things to happen. If you had a creature with +1/+1 counters on it, and you played Humility, those counters would get wiped out. They'd still be on the creature, they just wouldn't apply. So your creature with 5 +1/+1 counters on it, just a 1/1. But then if you put more counters on after Humility, those counters would apply. So what to do about this? Well, no immediately obvious solution presented itself, so R&D did what they'd always done with rules problematic cards. They pretended the problem doesn't exist, waited for the card to rotate out of constructed play, and hoped nothing burned to the ground in the meantime. So solutions would come, but not all at once, and they'd take years to come. And the first step towards those solutions came in 6th edition, when R&D finally decided that a truly formal rules document was needed, to replace the tiny rules booklet and intricate web of judge rulings that had existed before. This new comprehensive rules weren't actually comprehensive, but they completely overhauled most of Magic's systems, including how to apply effects. This is when the Nocturnal Raid Deathlace combo changed to not being a combo. This is when effects started from instants and abilities actually started locking in. So there were still things that the rules didn't cover in 6th edition, because the rules team was too busy figuring out how absolutely everything normal worked before figuring out the corner cases. But the corner cases would come with time. When they came up, they'd deal with them. So they started doing that cleanup in the very next set, in 7th edition. Because the rules team, at that time, solved copy effects. At this time, R&D had been forced to stop printing copy effects since Tempest, because the rules for them were insane. The dependencies caused them to do absolutely insane things that they could not possibly risk coming up in tournaments. And the rules team finally realized that most of those problems would be solved if they just said, hey, you know what? All your copy effects, those go first. Just always. Just copy effects first. By defining copy effects as their own special group and applying them first, they could force them to work coherently. Maybe not completely intuitively, but in a way that you could tell players, okay, this is how copy effects work. They always go first. Nothing applies under a copy. You never, when you copy something else, you don't get anything else. You just get the copy. And that worked. The first layer system was born. Start with the printed text and apply copy effects. And then apply type changing effects, then counters, and then everything else. We're good, right? Well, what if an effect does multiple things? Drownless Crusade changes colors, types, and power and toughness. So it's a type changing effect, right? But that means you apply it before humility. But then it works differently than a card that just changes color or size, like Glorious Anthem. So, Drownless Crusade and humility, it doesn't matter what effect applies. Humility applies over top of Drownless Crusade. It doesn't matter what order you played them. Drownless Crusade will never give your goblins +1/+1 while humility is in play. But Glorious Anthem, well, that depends. If you played Glorious Anthem first, humility wipes it out. If you played it second, humility doesn't wipe it out. Your creatures are now +2/+2, are now 2/2s. So this was less than ideal, but hell. Dependencies still exist, so humility is still causing all sorts of weirdness, double hell. Well, at least you don't have to care about whether +1/+1 counters were put on the creature before or after humility, because humility would always overwrite the counters. That's good, right? So there are another 2 years of this, and the rules team finally got fed up with all of it, and decided to lay down the law. Your effect wants to do multiple different things, each part applies separately, in the appropriate layer. Wait, what if humility removes the ability before it applies? Nope, never mind. Just continue to apply to whatever you were applying it before. It's okay, finish applying it to whatever. Don't worry about it. What about humility and dependencies? Nope, doesn't happen. Things can only be dependent on something in the same layer. Oh, and we'll add control changing effects and text changing effects into their own layers because, funny story, they weren't actually included in the rules before this. Whoops, our bad. So now we have 6 layers. Copy, control, text, type, miscellaneous, whatever, and power and toughness. They didn't actually include the word whatever in the rules, but you can see it there. So this reverses the ruling on humility and counters, but it's still consistent, so it doesn't really matter. And you can see the modern system starting to take shape here. But there's still a problem with this approach. Turning things into creatures. Under that system that I just outlined, how would this work? So if you play Glorious Anthem, and then animate your land with Kamal, all of your PT power toughness effects would be applied in the same layer. So your land would become a 1/1, but Glorious Anthem has an earlier timestamp.
This is the same problem as the very first example.
This
That's not way.
Yeah, it's back. Living land is back.
Because your creature becomes a 1/1 in layer 4. Layer 3? Layer 4. I can't remember which one it actually was at the time. But your land became a creature in an earlier layer. So, but if you didn't apply the power toughness at that time, then your creature would have an undefined power and toughness. So when the time came to apply power toughness changing effects later on, and you applied them in timestamp order, Glorious Anthem would go first and say, okay, this creature gets +1/+1. What's its power and toughness now? Well, before it was hell if I know. And so now it's hell if I know +1 and hell if I know +1. And then Kamal comes along and says, okay, it's 1/1. So your creature would never get the bonus from Glorious Anthem, which is not ideal. So they decided, fine, type changing effects can be their own little special snowflake. Apply everything done by a type changing effect in the same layer. So apply them all in the layer 4, and we'll just issue errata to all the cards that this screws up, like Geronimo's Crusade from earlier. So we'll figure something out for the next core set. Turns out they were a couple months late, but when Ravnica City of Guilds hit the street, just after 9th edition, they brought a different fix to the type changing issue. Even more layers! They got rid of type changing effects special snowflake status and instead solved the problem by breaking power and toughness into multiple sublayers. They were characteristic setting abilities, what we would call characteristic defining abilities today. Miscellaneous, because there's still a whole whatever issue. Counters. Static abilities that modify power and toughness without setting power and toughness to a specific value. And then power and toughness switching, because they just printed a bunch of power and toughness switching cards in Champions of Kamigawa and they didn't want players' brains to melt. So, in this miscellaneous section, you would apply static abilities that set power and toughness to a specific value, so you apply humility, and you would also set things like giant growth, one-shot effects. So then, if humility came around, you would apply humility here, counters applied over top of it, then you'd apply Glorious Anthem. So now how Glorious Anthem interacted with humility was consistent, because all of your static effects would always apply over top. Humility would overwrite any one-shot effects that came before it, but that wasn't too big a deal. And this special snowflake issue finally went away, because you would set the power and toughness first in the earlier layer, and then Glorious Anthem would come along later, no matter what. So, a long time happened. This took a long time. This took like 8 years. So finally, all problems solved, right? Well, not quite, because there was one tiny little problem. Kavu Runner. Kavu Runner has haste as long as an opponent controls a white or blue creature. But color and abilities are applied in the same layer. So there's a dependency here. Shifting Sky. Oh, sorry, as long as no opponent controls a white or blue creature. So if you say your opponent controls a white or blue creature, and you play Shifting Sky, making everything red instead, your Kavu still doesn't have haste, because Kavu Runner applies first. So your Kavu Runner doesn't get haste, and then Shifting Sky comes along and turns everything to the right color. But hey, that's a card that hasn't been in Standard for years and nobody plays it. Who cares? It's not like it's ever going to matter that abilities and color are in the same layer and therefore dependencies can still exist between them, right? Right? Then Eventide hit. And so did Snakefall. All of a sudden, this almost forgotten problem reared its ugly head in Standard. It could even come up in Limited, of all places. So how does this work, under the rules that existed at the time? Any guesses?
Favor of the overbeing would just work if the creature was green or blue, and if it had been snake form, favor of the overbeing wouldn't care.
So if the creature was green already, favor of the overbeing and snake form wouldn't have any dependency issues, because applying snake form doesn't change whether or not favor of the overbeing's effect applies. So you would apply them in timestamp order. If you snake formed a favor of the overbeing creature that was already green, the creature would lose trample, and it would lose flying. But if the creature wasn't green already, if it was just blue, then all of a sudden there is a dependency issue, because turning your creature green will turn on the vigilance ability. Oh, it's vigilance, not trample. Whatever. Well, making the creature green will give it vigilance. So there's a dependency issue, so you need to apply snake form first. So you apply snake form. which makes it lose all abilities, which probably includes the flying that it already has. And then it becomes green. And then Favor of the Overbeing applies on top of that, so now your creature has vigilance, despite you playing snake form on it. So, okay, fine, we'll fix this. When's the next core set? Magic 2010? Okay, color now has its own layer. And while we're at it, we'll fix power and toughness effects, because we're told that setting power and toughness to a specific value and applying power, giant growth and all of that, that's kind of confusing. Okay, we'll change it. Happy now? So now we have the modern layer system. Copy, control, text, type, color, abilities, power and toughness. And power and toughness is split into characteristic defining abilities, things that set power and toughness to specific values, things that modify power and toughness, then counters, then things that switch. So, are we good? Turns out, yes. This is the same layer setup we have today. These final changes happened in 2009, and we haven't had any significant changes since then. Ability loss effects, they're still a touch confusing when they don't stop other abilities from applying, but they're infinitely better than they used to be. And they're so relatively easy now that more ability loss effects have been printed in the 7 years than existed in all of normal tournament Magic beforehand, over the entire history of the game. So, no matter how confusing they possibly are, they're infinitely better than they were before, because dependencies were infinitely worse. And all it took to get here was 17 years. And a little bit of humility. All right, do I have any questions?
Yeah.
Yes?
Is dominating illicit still a problem?
No, dominating illicit is not a problem.
Can you explain what the problem was and how they fixed it?
Yes. Okay, so let me just quickly back up one so we actually have the current layers displayed. Okay, so the problem with dominating illicit was, at the time, dominating illicit said something to the effect of, this creature becomes an aura and gains, you control enchanted creature, and attach it to target creature, whatever. But the problem was that you were giving it the control effect with an effect that granted an ability. So when you went through the layers, you go, okay, nothing here, nothing here, nothing here, nothing here, nothing here. Oh, now I'm granting abilities. So now my creature has that you control enchanted creature. But you already passed control 4 or 5 layers ago. So the control effect would never get a chance to apply, because by the time it got the ability that granted it the control changing effect, too late, doesn't matter. So the way they fixed that was they actually took the you control enchanted creature part out of the becomes an aura ability and just gave it to dominating illicit. So now dominating illicit is a creature that says you control enchanted creature. I think they did the same thing later on with Bestow. They did the same thing a couple years ago with Bestow, or Siren of some sort.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hypnotic Siren. Yeah,
So
that was
under the
Bestow.
new system,
Yeah.
is it easier for them to change the card's oracle text to make sense within the configuration of the layer system?
I'm not entirely sure what you mean.
I guess with dominating illicit, was that an oracle change that?
Yes, that was an oracle change that
Okay.
did that. They basically said, okay, here's how we want this card to work. How can we mash its oracle text together so that it works the way we want?
Perfect.
They did the same thing back with Drawn Loose Crusade, just after Rodin came out. There was a bunch of different effects that had type changing effects and also did other things that they didn't want to do that. So they would say, okay, we'll issue a route into this thing. We'll split the type changing effect, and so it's its own separate thing so that it doesn't screw this up. So issuing a route, it can work. Next one.
I'm interested in the way that cards get templated with respect to this, because Wizards sometimes has an allergy, and rightly so, to referring to elements of the rules on cards, for example, the stack. Can you reflect on any ways they've changed how they might reference layers on cards in rule text?
They don't.
Just flat out,
They
don't,
do not reference layers on rules text.
Yeah,
They reference the stack occasionally,
yeah.
but that's about as far as it goes, and they only do that when it's absolutely necessary. On chaotic multiplayer rares usually, Grip of Chaos, they did. So they never reference the layer system on cards themselves.
Right, so does the fact that they don't do that, the fact they always write these things as just like rules, right, you gain control of,
Yeah.
how much does that influence what they're able to do with the technology of the layer system?
Well, one of the drawbacks of having the layer system is that you can't have certain effects. You can't have a power toughness effect that you can't have a color effect that wants to depend on power and toughness. You can't have a static ability that says all creatures with power 5 or less are green. That just doesn't work. Because you would make everything green before you actually modify power and toughness.
And is this what you were saying about Nocturnal Raid and Deathlay? So you came back to that briefly. Like I sort of understood that for a while there you could make a creature black and then also give it +2 power for the turn, but then later you could. But you said they fixed the combo, and I'm not sure
Sorry,
yet.
the way that they fixed it is that they made it work the way it does now.
Okay.
So when an instant or sorcery or an activated or triggered ability resolves, and it says this set of creatures gets this bonus, it locks in the set of things that it's going to apply to at that time. And adding new creatures to the set afterwards will not cause those things to be affected.
Oh, I
So
see.
if you play Languish and then play a creature, that creature will not get -4/-4.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Whereas before 6th edition, it would.
Oh, okay, that's, yeah. So, right, that's just a different rule that doesn't have to do with
it's a
players.
different rule,
I
yes.
didn't realize that's how that worked, yeah.
Yeah. John?
I still didn't get clear of that. Why is a copy the first layer?
Copy effects are the first layer because if you apply anything else first, then when you copy something, you get those effects. And you really don't want that to happen because if you have anything else that comes before copying effects, if anything else gets copied, if you had abilities get copied as well, then you run into a situation where you have a card that grants, your opponent has a card that grants first strike to all of their creatures. And you play a copy effect, you gain control of, you copy one of their creatures that is under the effect of this knighthood and that has first strike because of this static effect, and all of a sudden your creature has first strike, even though first strike is not printed anywhere on the card. And then if knighthood disappears, your creature still has first strike. Even though there's nothing on the table that says it should have first strike, it still has first strike because it was a copy when it did have, of something that did have first strike.
I feel like I have a good intuition for why layers 1, 2, and 3 are right at the top, but
Yeah.
and 7 at the bottom, I guess.
Yes.
But why are 4, 5, and 6 in the order that they're in?
Basically because of the way that cards existed, because of the existing cards at the time.
Okay,
So
so what you're saying
you-
is some abilities we can't print now, but there's some abilities we have printed, it's too late.
Basically, when they were deciding the order of the layers, they said, okay, what cards exist right now and how can we make those make sense? So we already had things that looked for type and changed the color or changed the abilities. We already had things that said, your creatures have this ability. Your creatures are blue. These things already existed, so color and abilities had to come after type. Because if they didn't, all of those existing cards would no longer work. So now we can't print anything that says your green permanents are creatures, or your green creatures are goblins, but it's better than not being able to print those few things is worth the price of admission. Jeremy. Okay, sorry, you're just stretching? Okay.
I wanted to answer Nixon, just recently they've started printing cards that say base power and toughness.
Oh,
One,
yes.
which isn't exactly referencing layers, but is trying to like help make, it seemed to me like they started doing that so that like when players advance to like competitive tournaments, they're starting to get familiar with these rules called whatever. That just seems like a nod to competitive to me, I don't know.
It's not so much a nod, it's sort of leading players along.
Right.
By saying base power and toughness, you sort of get that intuitive hint that, okay, this is the base. This is where you start from.
Right.
And then you build on that.
It helps them understand maybe if you
Yeah.
make something a 1/1 that has already been giant growth, it's still now a 4/4 instead of that.
Yeah, exactly. It's, okay, this is the base. So now you apply the giant growth on top of the base. So that was the reason that they introduced that terminology, was to try to
Thanks.
make more sense for
That's the
players.
closest to
Seems
the.
to have worked.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, David.
Why are 7C and 7D separate?
I have no clue. Probably because they were always separate beforehand, and they didn't see a good reason to combine them.
That's a very unsatisfying answer.
Yeah, it is a very unsatisfying answer, but it's the only answer that I have. I have actually suggested that they merge them before, but there's no reason to, so they haven't.
Don't we have a new rules manager now?
Yes, we
Very
have
recently.
Eli Schifrin.
Maybe you
Probably not. No. Eli is very big into solving actual problems that exist instead of optimizing things. So optimizing things for the sake of optimizing things really doesn't hold much appeal for rules managers in general, Eli or Tabak in particular, because it's a bunch of work. They have to double check everything. They have to double check all of the cards that exist to say, does this screw anything up? And why go to all that trouble when it's not causing any problems?
Speaking to that, on top of that, doesn't that get back to your like Kamal and like your Anthem effects? You really don't want to deal with Undef, especially now that we have Moto. Having setting happen first kind of avoids any Undef situations. If I'm
You're using computer terminology?
Yeah.
Over my head.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you could have things.
Undefined. Oh.
Yeah, sorry. You could have things, and you wouldn't know what their power toughness is. You would know that it got +1/+1, but now it's like, what is it?
Yeah,
Whereas you just like set everything,
Yeah.
now you can manipulate it.
Yeah, that is why setting comes first.
Sure.
So that
That's why
afterwards you
AMP
can modify everything. So characteristic defining abilities are technically just a subset of setting power and toughness, but you apply them first because they're actually on the cards themselves.
Was there ever a time when switching power toughness didn't happen last?
Yes. Anytime before 9th edition, anytime before Ravnica, switching power and toughness was actually just the same as any other power and toughness modifying effect. So it would be like a giant growth. You would apply, if you had a 1/2 creature and you applied, if you had a 1/2 creature and you switched its power and toughness, it would now be a 2/1. If you gave it +2/+1, it would now be a 4/2. So you just applied all of those things in the order that they occurred. So now switching power and toughness is a lot easier because if you switch something, you just do all of the calculations first and then you switch at the end. And if you switch multiple times, it doesn't matter because you just go back and forth until you're finished.
And was that just cleaner?
Yes.
There wasn't any, we don't like people doing, because it was kind of cool the way it happened before.
It was
just
kind of cool,
taxing,
but
right?
it was a lot harder to figure out. Because it was
Not always.
interesting. It allowed you to do some interesting things, but it was a lot more confusing because you had to remember when exactly the switch occurred. You had to remember the exact timestamp order of when this switch occurred as opposed to all of the other things. So by applying switching last, you don't need to worry about any of that.
Can you talk a bit about why layer 3 and layer 6? Or is there a history there?
Basically, layer 3 is separate from layer 6 because Mind Bend and Magical Hack.
Right.
That Mind Bend and Magical Hack say change the text of target permanent by replacing all instances of this with something else. And those need to apply
Before
type even.
Oh, okay.
They need to apply before color. They also need to apply before type because artificial evolution was printed.
You lost me.
Artificial evolution says change the text of target spell, target whatever, by replacing all instances of one creature type with another.
There are also cards that change basic line types, right?
Yeah, yes, and basic line types.
Okay, so
And
what
basic line
maybe
types.
affected it? Okay.
So yeah, so it needs to apply before type, it needs to apply before
If you want,
abilities.
even Blood Moon, you do want a magical hack Blood Moon
Yeah,
You
you
do
can
it this
magical hack
order
garbage.
to work, right?
To make, yeah.
To make that
Yeah.
effect work, yeah.
Yeah, if you could, if those were applied for abilities, then magical hacking Blood Moon would not work. So,
Adrian, what kind of world would we live in?
yeah, exactly.
And why would anyone play
Basically, it would mean that such text changing effects wouldn't really work at all, except when you're doing things like changing protection from red to protection from blue. It wouldn't affect any sort of thing that actually modified anything else, which is definitely not how players think they would work, so can't have that.
Thank you.
Players love talking about how Moto likes to switch the rules on them occasionally as they
Yes, it
fix
does.
cards.
Yes.
As a layers guru,
Yeah.
have you heard of any fun interactions that had to get changed on Moto that might be directly there?
There have been a lot of Moto bugs over the years. I can't recall any that are specifically layer-based. Most of the real problems with Moto happen with things changing zones and replacement effects and prevention effects, not giving you all the proper options, not applying in the right order. So there are probably some corner cases, but I haven't researched them. I don't know for sure what specifically Moto layer screw-ups are. There's probably a bunch, but I haven't heard of them. I don't actually play Moto very much, so I go for the mojo and that's it. Okay,
Something not quite directly related.
sure.
Why are layers ordered copy control and replacement effects are ordered control copy?
So layers are ordered copy control so that you can copy something that gives you control of something. So you can play copy enchantment and copy a confiscate. So you can play copy enchantment, I copy your confiscate, stealing whatever. Because if it was the other way around, I would copy your confiscate, and you have the same problem that you had with dominating Bishop before.
That's how Game of Thrones.
Yes, that's how you go. Play copy enchantment when somebody has a confiscate. That'll work. That is totally not an overreaction.
Do you want to tell us the history? I don't know if there's other pressing questions. If we have a bit of more time, can you tell us the history of how humility and opalescence have interacted?
Oh God!
You broke him.
Isn't that why you're giving this talk?
Okay. First, I'll mention briefly why control effects work before copy effects for replacements. That's so that you know under whose control an object is entering the battlefield under. Because if you don't know whose control something is entering the battlefield under, then you don't know which effects need to apply to it. So you have something entering the battlefield. There was Essence of the Wild. All of your things entering the battlefield as copies of Essence of the Wild. So if your opponent was using Gather Specimens, you play a creature with, you control Essence of the Wild, they gather specimens. You apply the copy effect first, so your creature becomes an Essence of the Wild, but then they get it. So they get an Essence of the Wild despite them not having any essences of the wild to start with, which is weird. So you apply the control changing effect first for replacement effects. As for humility and opalescence, for a long time it was entirely dependency based.
Okay.
So you would apply, so if there was only one humility and one opalescence, that's fine, you apply them in timestamp order because they don't depend on each other. Humility turns itself into a 1/1 creature with no abilities, but you don't care. It's just a 1/1 creature with no abilities. The rules don't try to backtrack and change it so that it's not, and then go back and forth and back. The rules just don't do that. So, but if you had two opalescences, then all of a sudden you'd have dependencies and timestamps would matter, and things would start burning. Then you've come to, then when 8th edition finally hit, and type changing abilities were put into their own layer before abilities, then all of a sudden there was no dependency ever. You apply opalescence first, then humility. The power and toughness would still depend on timestamp, but at least what was and wasn't a creature would not be affected. You don't need to worry about that. There was a brief period in time where before humility was, let's see, can I just, there was a brief period in time just before 6th edition where somebody actually read the card and realized, oh wait, this says the creature loses all abilities and is a 1/1 creature. Shouldn't that be a type changing effect? Oh shit, no, not a type changing effect, just issue errata to it. It's not, it doesn't change types. That's how they, basically how they solved it. They said, they issued errata and then said, yeah, without this errata, things would get screwed up. Because it would stop things from being artifacts, it would stop things from being whatever, it would just, no. It's bad enough, we don't want it any worse.
Then you are druggy.
All right. So, any more questions? No? Fantastic. Thanks very much. Now there's a test.
Well, there kind of is a test.
Oh.
For those of you who are going to be around at 1, we're going to run a round of Judge Power in that